Mask of a Diva, a Stan Kraychik mystery, Book 4, 1994. Author, Grant Michaels. Publisher, St. Martin's Press, New York. Author, Eric Aust. For all the divas, operatic and otherwise. Chapter 9. The ambulance arrived along with 2 officers from the Abigail police. The opinion of the medics was that a portion of Adam Pierce's spine had been crushed by the impact of the pipe. As if to absolve any feelings of guilt that we in the Opera House might have felt for failing to save Adam, the medics assured us that injuries like that were always fatal and nothing could have saved him. But they were also careful to remind us that the official cause of death would be determined by the county medical examiner. While Adam's body awaited further examination, the police sergeant ordered us all to remain in the Opera House for routine questioning. "No big deal," he said impassively. "I'll just need to interrogate you all for a little while." He lingered on the I word and savored each syllable. Interrogate. He acted like the head of security for a country club, moving too deliberately, relishing every micron of power in his tiny domain. He was nothing like the Boston cop I knew, who often seemed plagued by his own authority. We were all to wait out in the auditorium where we would each be called in turn to be questioned by the sergeant. The house lights were brought up and we all dispersed from the stage. Madama had since been rescued from behind the fallen scrum and was babbling to Mathilda and the maestro. I caught words here and there, things like Malaccio and La Veneta, and the maestro seemed to be having trouble finding a light for his cigarette. As I headed into the wings, Rhonda Luca caught up with me. In a whisper for my ears alone, she murmured, "Too bad that pipe didn't hit the cow instead." I glanced sharply at her. She'd uttered my exact thought. Out in the audience, Daphne was sitting in the same seat where I'd left her. "Were you too upset to come up on stage?" I said. She answered, "I'm sorry, I couldn't help. The sight of blood unnerves me. Even a paper cut makes me woozy. Show me a mine that's laid open with a gaping fatal wound, and then I can dive right into it. To the deepest, darkest places and try to fix it, but the sight of blood or broken bones," Daphne shuddered. "That part of medical school was a nightmare for me." "But there was no blood up there," I said before I could edit myself. "Still," said Daphne. "It's all under control now," I offered quickly, as if to retract my insolent gaffe. She chortled. "Oh, I hardly believe that." "Neither do I," said. Daphne sighed heavily. "I wonder what will happen now." "The police will question us." "I meant with the festival," said Daphne. "Is that why you didn't go up on stage?" "The police," Daphne explained. "Since the beginning, I've tried to maintain the spirit that the festival would be smooth sailing, as if everything should fall magically into place, because it was all for the sake of art. But that's hardly the truth. Just getting the town father's approval was a major hurdle. Then there was satisfying the building inspectors' infernal safety regulations about the performance center. And then followed the countless requests from local charities I never knew existed." I said, "Since you knew the police would be here now, you chose not to face them so soon after that suicide yesterday." Daphne gave me a cold stare, then said, "Young man, you may yet be a psychologist." "Or else a very suspicious detective." "The best mind healers are," she said, then continued, "You're quite right, though. The chief of police was adamantly opposed to an opera festival in our cozy enclave of Abigail by the Sea. The increased revenues to the town were hardly needed to maintain our privileged existence, but beyond that he felt that the increased tourism, especially the fussy opera lovers, would require too much attention from him and his men. After Sonia Hatfield's suicide and my connection to her, this accident is exactly what the chief has been waiting for. Something that might make the opera folks pack up and go away for good." Daphne's words raised all kinds of new questions for me. Whose imagination is always raring to run wild? I wondered, could Adam Pierce's death possibly have been intentional? Then who had released the scrum to drop onto him that way? Jonathan Byers' catamite Rick, darling thing? He was supposed to be out filling the car with gasoline, but he could have sneaked back into the opera house and done the deed. But did he have the capacity to be jealous enough to commit such an act? Or was the accident meant for one of the others who was on stage? Jonathan Byers himself? Or Madame Ostinata? Or was it an act of random terrorism to subvert the opera festival? But perpetrated by whom? The police? And then another troubling question arose. Had Sonia Hatfield, the tragic suicide, perhaps been pushed under that train? When my turn with the police came, I was giving them a clear account of what I'd seen, when I had an insight that surprised even me. I discovered that my subconscious mind had made its own observations in the first microseconds after the pipe hit Adam Pierce, even before my reflexes had propelled me from my seat to go and help him. A part of me had surveyed the opera house and registered exactly who had been visible at that moment and who was not. I don't know why I did it. Maybe some dormant genome for inductive reasoning had been activated by my previous involvement with bizarre murders, and my mind had already made the leap that Adam Pierce's death might not have been an accident. Whatever the reason, I had made a quick mental catalog of everyone who was out of sight and perhaps somewhere backstage at the moment of the accident. That list included Rhonda Luca, Hwang Young, Cho, April Kilkus, Rick Jansen, Bruce David, Mathilda, Mastro Toscanelli, and Carolyn Boetz, and the countless names of members of the crew. I told the Abigail police all this, but they didn't seem too impressed. Too much speculation, I guess, but I had also observed that the only people with irrefutable alibis concerning the accident were Madame Ostinata and Jonathan Byers, who were both on stage with Adam Pierce, and Daphne, who was in the audience with me. Anyone else could have released that deadly scrim, including the ailing Daniel Carafolio, who was presumably recuperating in his room, or the heartsick Maurizio, who was presumably back on Daphne's estate, awaiting my troth. When I returned to the auditorium, I found Daphne and the maestro still trying to placate Madame Ostinata. The maestro was lighting his cigarette with what looked to be a solid gold lighter. Perhaps Daphne had supplied it to him, but then, once the cigarette was lit, rather than smoke it, ever the maestro, he seemed to conduct the conversation with it. Surprisingly, no one told him to put it out. Mathilda stood by, voiceless as usual, awaiting an order to fetch whatever exotic elixir might be needed to calm Madame's nerves. For her part, Madame Ostinata was ranting that she had been the intended victim of the accident. I could tell the woman was truly terrified because her hair was almost standing on end. Then, as if to give credence to my observation, she said, "For reserve a capelle," as she tried to smooth down her frazzled fleece. She was certain that someone had purposely let that scrim drop, but it had missed its true mark. It was disquieting to realize that she and I shared the same lunatic interpretation of the facts, and her version even had religious overtones. It was not Lady Luck who had saved her, but El Buen Dio himself, and now, since Madama obviously wanted to live quite a bit longer, she was saying over and over that she would have to leave the festival. There was no choice. Yes, she understood that she would be breaking her contract, but what was a scrap of paper when her life was at stake? I swear, I saw obvious relief on some of the other faces among the cast and crew. That wasn't too surprising, though. From what I'd seen and heard so far, the festival's production of En Ballo in Mascala could not be improved by Marcella Ostinata's hasty retreat to Italy. I waited for the police to finish questioning Daphne. I hoped to ride back to the estate with her. Perhaps she might even offer the real dirt about how she had convinced the town fathers to approve the opera festival. When she saw me, she seemed relieved that I had waited for her, but then, just as we were leaving the opera house, she stopped and said, "I must find Maurizio first." "Is he here?" I said. Daphne replied, "He came along with me when I brought Bruce David." He's going to drive the other guests back to the house. Then maybe he's waiting in the minivan, I offered. It's more likely that he's been wandering around inside. He spent a lot of time here when the theater was being built, especially the stage house. Then Daphne laughed and added, I think he might have grease paint in his blood. Which caused me to wonder, had Maurizio been backstage when the accident occurred? As it turned out, no one inside had seen him, but the police did make a point of getting his name from Daphne for questioning later on. You'll need a sign language interpreter, she told the sergeant, barely concealing a haughty tone in her voice. He's deaf and mute. The cop made a disapproving grimace and said, Then maybe you can help us when we question him. Daphne gave a condescending smile. You know, I'm only too glad to cooperate, Sergeant. Once more, Daphne and I left the theater, and once again she stopped us before we got out the main door. I hope you'll forgive me for asking you, she said, but since Maurizio has disappeared again, do you think you might drive the others back to the house? It would mean you're waiting around here for them to finish with the police, but I don't know what else to do. It would help me tremendously. I'd be glad to, I said, even though I wanted to get away from the opera house myself. Enough of these folks was enough. Thank you, said Daphne, and if by chance Maurizio does reappear, she added, remember to be gentle with him. I'll do my best, said Cream Puff Kraychik. Daphne drove off in the Bentley, and I went back into the opera house. It was strangely quiet inside the vast auditorium, and it had become cooler as well. I made my way silently down an outside aisle, hoping the cops wouldn't notice me. But it didn't work. One of them saw me and called me up to the front of the house. I told him that I'd already withstood the Inquisition and was just waiting to drive some of the musicians back to Daphne's estate. He told me to wait outside. I told him it was too hot out there. He told me he didn't care. I told him I'd keep out of the way. I promised. Okay, so I groveled. I tried to explain to him that some of these people were world-class performers. They weren't common criminals. Then again, one of them might have been exactly that. But I was their escort, and part of my job was to ensure that they received the deferential treatment they deserved. The cop made a sour face. I don't think he appreciated my vocabulary. He told me to sit down and shut up. I quickly surveyed the audience for the most fertile site to conduct my own kind of interrogation. The maestro and Mathilda was sitting far apart in the front row, silent as stone, yet I could see they were both anxious. The maestro was lighting another cigarette with the gold lighter, still heedless of any no-smoking rule. Madama Ostinata was apparently being questioned at the moment, and no doubt the maestro and Mathilda was preparing for her return in their respective ways. Bruce David was sitting a few rows behind them, alone and looking lost and worried, sucking on another pastel and stewing in his own precious juice. Already I could tell that the ride back to the estate with those 4 people together in the minivan was going to be an adventure in hypocrisy. I felt myself salivate. Meanwhile, Jonathan Byers was leaning against the rail of the orchestra pit and trying his congenial Brit act on one of the cops. But to no avail. Ricky Jansen was nowhere in sight. Presumably he was still out buying gasoline. And then I spotted April Kilkis and Huang Young Cho sitting together about 12 rows back, off to one side. They appeared relaxed, as though they were taking a break from rehearsal, as though nothing bad had happened that morning. No scrim, no death, no cops. They could have been discussing the rise and fall of the 19th century opera, but one thing was obvious. Huang Young Cho was in love with April Kilkis. I don't know what he was saying to her, but when someone shows that kind of passion in animation, they don't want to prove a point. They want sex. Besides, even from where I was standing, I could see that Huang's eyes were on fire. The query of choice in that auditorium was easy. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.